Hello, my friends. I look at the mess we're in today. Ukraine, Europe's crisis, Venezuela, Iran, Israel, as one single connected story. The slow collapse of the old Western imperial system and the birth of a new security architecture, with Russia right at the center of that transformation. Thanksgiving in the United States. From Europe, what I see is a Washington establishment and a European elite that are terrified of losing control, and a Russian leadership that has been remarkably consistent about what it wants. A neutral Ukraine, no NATO on its borders, and a stable security order across Eurasia. Everything else is noise layered on top of that basic reality. Take the so-called 28-point Trump peace plan for Ukraine. People mocked it, dismissed it as nonsense, or called it a trap for Russia. I don't see it that way at all. It's not a detailed peace treaty. It's a framework for negotiations. Each of those 28 points could easily be a few pages of text when written out clearly. But inside that framework are several fundamental elements that go exactly to the root of what caused this war in the first place. First, the plan says Ukraine cannot be part of NATO. That is the non-negotiable demand Moscow's put on the table since long before the war started. For years, the Russians said, do not drag Ukraine into NATO. Do not park Western military infrastructure on our border, because we will not tolerate it and we will eventually be forced to intervene. That was not propaganda. It was a clear red line. Any serious peace arrangement, from the Russian point of view, must address that root cause. This plan does. Second, it doesn't stop at a political promise. It requires Ukraine to enshrine neutrality in its constitution. That means a constitutional commitment not to join Western military alliances, no NATO troops permanently stationed on Ukrainian soil, and a formal limitation on Ukraine's armed forces, their size, their structure, and their equipment. The text we've seen mentions no nuclear weapons, but in reality, the Annexon forces could run several pages specifying what kinds of weapons are allowed and what are banned. Third, the plan doesn't just constrain Ukraine. It also demands a formal legal commitment from Russia not to attack Western countries. Moscow has repeatedly said it has no intention of attacking anyone else in Europe. But this framework would require the Russian state to pass a law through the Duma renouncing territorial claims and pledging not to invade Western nations. That matters because it undercuts the endless fear-mongering from European politicians and NATO generals who keep telling their populations, the Russians are coming. After Ukraine, Putin will march on London or Berlin. He's never said any such thing, but if you censor alternative voices, people start to believe this nonsense. A Russian law codifying the absence of territorial ambitions would puncture that hysteria and expose those warmongers as liars. Fourth, the plan deals with reconstruction. Critics scream that it's about stealing $100 billion of Russian assets. But that's exactly what the Europeans want to do under their own approach. Confiscate frozen Russian reserves, use them as collateral, issue loans through Western banks, and then magically convert that collateral into permanent seizure by calling it war reparations. Under that model, Russia has zero say. London, Paris, and Berlin run everything, and Russian money simply disappears into European financial plumbing. The 28-point framework is different. It envisages a joint U.S.-Russian fund for Ukraine's reconstruction. That means Moscow has a seat at the table in deciding priorities and programs. And that makes sense, because it is not in Russia's interest to have a broken, impoverished, Nazi-infested, failed state on its border. What serves Russian interests in the long term is a stable, well-ordered, reasonably prosperous neighbor, something closer to today's Belarus. Neutral, friendly, and predictable. A joint reconstruction fund is a way to build exactly that while also deepening U.S.-Russia cooperation instead of permanent confrontation. The plan also includes provisions on education and ideology, what Russia calls denazification. After 2014, Kyiv passed laws elevating World War II Nazi collaborators into national heroes and even criminalizing criticism of them. Textbooks openly promoted racist narratives and hatred of Russians. If you want real peace, you cannot leave that ideological poison untouched. So the framework rightly points toward reforming education, uprooting racist and Nazi-inspired doctrines, and addressing the language issue. That is completely aligned with Russia's stated objectives from the Minsk period onward. A lot of Western commentators obsess about territory. Will Russia keep this or that oblast? Will the current line of control be frozen? Who wins Zaporozhye or Kherson? They think Russia's getting a bad deal if it doesn't annex more land. I don't think Moscow sees it that way. For Russia, the crucial question is not the color of the map on CNN. It's who exercises real political dominance and decisive influence over Kiev's strategic choices. There are basically two ways to achieve that. One is purely military. You roll tanks into city after city, dismantle local institutions, and administer everything yourself. An incredibly costly approach in blood and treasure. The other way is administrative and political. You gain influence over the central government in Kyiv and then have Ukrainian institutions themselves implement the policies that meet your security needs. Neutrality. No foreign bases, no NATO, no hostile ideologies weaponized in schools. That second route is much cheaper and far less destructive. So if Russia can get genuine neutrality and influence via a negotiated settlement, it has no reason to insist on painting the whole map red. That's why I see this 28-point plan as a serious foundation for negotiation rather than some cunning anti-Russian trap. Many details will be flexible in talks. Some items even give Russia an opportunity to show goodwill by compromising on secondary issues, like shared management of the Zaporozhye nuclear plant. Compared with the rushed European plan, a kind of panicked counterproposal meant to block U.S.-Russia rapprochement, this U.S. framework is coherent and rooted in reality. Who opposes it most fiercely? Europe's weakest and most discredited actors. London, Paris, governments that are deeply unpopular at home, with no real military power and no leverage on the ground in Ukraine. They posture and bluster, but they don't hold the cards. And in the background, anti-corruption investigations in Ukraine, controlled largely by the U.S., are tearing apart Zelensky's inner circle. $100 million of embezzlement was just the opening act. Key members of his clique have already fled, some to Israel. The deeper probes are likely to expose not only Ukrainian oligarchs, but also European politicians and banks who helped siphon off tens of billions. Estonian banks, French elites, British and German players, all of them could end up smeared by what comes out. That's part of the leverage. Trump's quiet trip to London to see Keir Starmer isn't about tea and photo ops. Behind closed doors, the message is more like, we know where the money went. We can handle this the easy way or the ugly way. Similar pressure is almost certainly being applied to other European capitals. The longer Kyiv and Brussels resist a realistic peace framework, the worse their political position becomes as Russia advances on the ground and the financial corruption story slowly detonates under their feet. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Russian forces are pushing toward the Dnieper. The plan itself explicitly mentions non-interference with Ukrainian trade along the river. An interesting tell that the authors foresee a future where Russian troops are effectively on or near that line, but still allow economic flows. That kind of detail doesn't come out of nowhere. It reflects understandings already explored in back-channel talks, including the Alaska meetings in August, where, by all indications, U.S. and Russian officials reached a broad understanding to prevent a wider European war. We saw how this pattern works in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That country was being engineered into a second front against Russia through manufactured tensions among Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, particularly targeting the Serb entity Republika Srpska. The plan was to push it toward a secession referendum this fall. That would likely have triggered war with the central government in Sarajevo, pulled in Serbia and Croatia, and by extension NATO members Croatia and Hungary, forcing Russia to intervene on the Serbian side. It was a World War I playbook recycled: ignite the Balkans to drag great powers into a general conflagration. It didn't happen because Moscow pressured the Serb leadership to stay within the Dayton framework and delay secession, and because the Trump administration quietly backed leaders in Republika Srpska who were willing to resist the provocations. People on the ground compare. life under Biden to life under Trump, now as night and day, or living on a different planet. Under Trump, the immediate danger of war there has been diffused for at least a year. There's no big donor base from Bosnia in U.S. politics, no massive diaspora constituency to please. This wasn't about domestic votes. It was about preventing another front in the West's proxy war against Russia. That is what genuine security architecture work looks like when U.S. and Russian interests align. Inside Europe, though, something else is shaking: the financial system. Free speech is being strangled again, especially against voices that challenged lockdown orthodoxy in 2020, 2021. Popular anti-lockdown accounts with tens of thousands of followers are being wiped from platforms like Facebook without warning. At the same time, we get a 1,500-page inquiry from the British establishment that doesn't ask who should be jailed for the damage of lockdowns. Instead, it concludes the government was too hesitant and should have locked people down harder and faster next time, using the same discredited tools: mass masking, contact tracing, social distancing. And just days before and after that report, central banks like the ECB and Bank of England issue unusually blunt warnings about looming crises. That's not how they talk if everything is fine. Normally, they lull depositors into complacency. In 2019, we had the repocalypse in U.S. repo markets. In summer 2024, the Bank of England quietly had to step into UK repo markets. The Federal Reserve has also been forced back into these markets recently. That tells you liquidity is seizing up, and banks don't fully trust each other. When that happens, the central bank becomes the lender of last resort, or the entire system can freeze overnight. Against that backdrop, we have Ursula von der Leyen declaring Europe on the verge of a new global health emergency, and then silence for 10 weeks. No new deadly virus, no epidemiological justification, just a phrase hanging in the air. Put those pieces together and you get a picture. European elites know a dramatic economic and political crisis is coming. They have no good solution. So they're toying with the idea of dusting off the lockdown playbook, not to fight a pathogen, but to control populations in the midst of a financial avalanche and political collapse. Censor dissent. Keep people indoors. Deploy health as a pretext to contain unrest. The virus that's really eating away at Europe is in the banking system, not in people's lungs. As the war in Ukraine grinds toward a Russian victory and the Trump peace architecture gains weight, the EU faces a fork in the road: radical reform into a looser, more sovereign-friendly structure, or outright disintegration. NATO's aura of inevitability is already fading. When this is over, countries will gravitate eastward towards China's Belt and Road, BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Brussels, as we know it, is an unsustainable construct. Against this backdrop, it's almost comical to watch an Australian pundit retread the same tired script. We must give Ukraine enough firepower to raise the cost to Russia and force Moscow to negotiate. This line has been tested for nearly 4 years. Result: Russia has adapted, scaled up its arms production, and is winning on the ground. Europe's stockpiles, by contrast, are depleted. The only escalation step left, after all the missiles, howitzers, tanks, and F-16 seconds, is nuclear weapons. If that's what these people mean, they should say it openly and see how their publics react. In reality, this raise the cost rhetoric is just a cover for buying time. Time to prepare new fronts: Moldova, Finland, maybe a second attempt in the Balkans. Time to entrench the military-industrial complex. Every extra day of war means hundreds or more than 1,000 Ukrainian men dead and a steady trickle of NATO personnel killed in deniable roles. There is no path to victory here, only a path to a larger disaster. Now, shift to Venezuela. On the surface, U.S. military posturing around Venezuela, bombers, deployments, threats, looks like preparation for regime change war. But we've seen a similar pattern with Iran. Big buildup, dire headlines, and then nothing. I suspect Venezuela is being used as a pressure point, not a genuine target for invasion. The obvious explanation, oil, doesn't quite convince me. Yes, Venezuela's heavy crude is crucial for jet fuel and diesel, which U.S. fracked oil doesn't provide. That's why the Biden administration quietly did a sanctions for oil deal with Caracas after the Ukraine war began. But that's precisely the point. They already made a deal. If Trump now piles on threats, it's more likely leverage in a larger game than a straightforward oil grab. Immigration and elections are part of this. It's plausible that as part of those earlier deals, Venezuelan prisons were relieved of some of their worst inmates who were then encouraged to join the northbound migrant wave. It's also plausible that Venezuelan infrastructure, servers, developers, was used in parts of the U.S. election rigging machinery, alongside nodes in places like Serbia. If those things are true, then Washington, under Trump, has enormous leverage. Maduro can be told, in effect, cooperate with our investigations or face the Libyan scenario. You can force concessions with pressure without actually firing a shot. Marco Rubio appears again and again in these theaters. Iran, Ukraine, Venezuela. He's a hawk with strong personal and ideological motivations, particularly in Latin America. But within the current U.S. power configuration, he looks more like the representative of a losing faction. The 28-point Ukraine plan bears Trump's stamp, not Rubio's. Keith Kellogg, who helped present it, is already out. Peace and a new security architecture are being pushed by the strongest players, Washington and Moscow. While opposition comes from weak, cornered elites in Europe and their surrogates in Congress and the media. If Trump wanted a shooting war with Venezuela, he'd be taking an enormous risk for minimal gain. The upside would be some collateral assets for Wall Street and the City of London. It would not stop fentanyl, which flows through different routes and financial channels. It would invite endless blowback. Given how transactional Trump is, that trade-off doesn't make sense. So my expectation is heavy pressure on Caracas to deliver the goods, data, names, networks, but no Gulf of Mexico quagmire. When we talk about drugs, the real linchpin isn't Venezuela, it's the money laundering banks. Mexican cartels move on the order of $400 million a week in cash. You don't buy helicopters, RPGs, submarines, and sophisticated weapon systems with plastic bags full of bills. You do it via clean bank accounts. The banks that accept and launder that cash effectively anoint the cartel leadership. They decide whose money is recognized and whose is not, and thereby stabilize hierarchies that would otherwise fragment into 1,000 gangs killing each other over warehouse stashes. Without these banks, the entire structure collapses into chaos and self-destruction. And we know fentanyl labs tied to Canadian banks exist. If you truly wanted to wage war on drugs, that's where you'd start. Venezuela is peripheral by comparison. Look at Iran now. The 12-day war with Israel and the open threats from NATO members have fundamentally shifted thinking in Tehran. The proposal for a formal defense pact with Russia is not some decorative gesture. It reflects a deep recognition that NATO is not just Israel's backer, but the primary military arm of a Western empire that cannot tolerate genuinely sovereign regional powers. Inside Iran, there has long been debate between those favoring a turn toward the West and those arguing for alignment with Russia and China. After this war, that argument is being decided in favor of the Eurasian camp. People look at Germany openly saying Israel is doing its dirty work against Iran and ask, what exactly did we do to Germany to deserve that? The answer is nothing. Germany is occupied territory wrapped in a veneer of democracy. Its elites serve the empire, not German citizens. This empire, a successor to the British imperial system, has one core rule. No independent power centers on the Eurasian landmass. Countries like Iran, Russia, and China must either submit fully, open markets, natural resources, media, NGOs, education, banks, even cultural values, or be destabilized. If they say no to things like permanent Western control over their resources, unrestricted foreign civil society operations, or the ideological packages pushed under banners like open society. Then sanctions, color revolutions, terrorism, and war follow. NATO is just the military enforcement tool of that logic. Historically, Germany had every reason to cooperate constructively with Iran and the broader region. The old Berlin to Baghdad railway project was an early version of inter-Eurasian integration, conceptually similar to today's Belt and Road. That's precisely why Germany and the Ottoman Empire were destroyed in World War I, a war engineered by the same imperial logic. Today, Germany has U.S. and British bases all over its territory. Its intelligence services are subordinate to Washington and London. So when Berlin cheers on Israeli operations against Iran, it's not acting as an independent actor. It's speaking with the empire's voice. Then we come to Benjamin Netanyahu and the fear that he could drag the U.S. into a full-scale war against Iran before leaving office. That prospect deeply worries many in the American populist right as well, people who otherwise back Trump but distrust Netanyahu's agenda. And they're right to be worried. One reckless strike could trigger an avalanche. But a full-blown U.S.-Iran war would be suicidal not only for Israel but also for America's position in the region. Iran has the capacity to devastate Israeli infrastructure and flatten U.S. bases across West Asia. It has arsenals, missiles, drones, asymmetric capabilities against which the West has no reliable defense. It has a large, battle-hardened military and, crucially, deep strategic backing from both Russia and China. Moscow and Beijing have already designated Iran as an anchor of the new Eurasian security architecture. You don't remove a cornerstone of that structure with a few air raids. You risk collapsing your own position instead. Could the U.S. theoretically escalate to nuclear use? In theory, yes. But in practice, that would mean sacrificing Israel and every U.S. foothold in the region, poisoning any remaining legitimacy Washington has left worldwide. Do I believe Trump is willing to take that gamble? No. He is too transactional and too attuned to cost-benefit calculations. The upside of peaceful, profitable cooperation with Iran, a large, educated population, energy resources, industrial potential, vastly outweighs the upside of a catastrophic war. People like Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Victoria Nuland, and their fellow true believers in the old imperial project might be reckless enough to roll those dice. They are ideologues, and ideologues love gambles with other people's lives. But the currents now are moving in another direction. The more the public sees, the less appetite there is for endless wars on behalf of abstract values or the geopolitical fantasies of a tiny elite. On the cultural, spiritual level, you see voices like Tucker Carlson calling out Netanyahu not merely as a foreign leader, but as an enemy of the basic Western civilizational idea that every human being is flawed but redeemable, created by God and endowed with inherent dignity. The whole point of condemning Nazism was that it denied this universal human worth and instead treated some groups as irredeemably evil by birth. When a leader justifies persecution or slaughter on the basis of inherent group evil, he's stepping into that same moral swamp, whatever flag he flies and whatever religion he claims to defend. For at least 150 years, the empire has tried to bend all three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, into tools of division and control. The voices that get amplified are seldom the ones preaching peace, humility, and compassion. They're the ones screaming about enemies and holy wars. But beneath the noise, the common core remains. Most ordinary Christians, Muslims, and Jews want the same things: healthy children, a dignified life, peace, the chance to travel, learn, exchange culture, listen to each other's music and stories. You see this whenever people meet across borders without the intermediation of propaganda. To sustain permanent war, the empire has had to break millions of people psychologically through trauma, orphanhood, extremist indoctrination, intelligence programs like MK Ultra, and endless cycles of violence. Jihadist groups are populated with shattered human beings raised on twisted texts and then drugged and weaponized. Many Israelis, too, live in a society permanently on edge, traumatized and morally distorted by decades of occupation and aggression built into their state's founding logic. A state created at the expense of the indigenous population, with that population endlessly humiliated and repressed, will inevitably produce broken spirits on all sides. Yet, there is hope. The very fact that we can see all this in real time, discuss it openly, and bypass official censorship with alternative platforms is shifting the balance. It's not just young leftists in Western cities turning away from Israel's narrative. It's middle-aged conservatives as well. The ground is moving under the feet of those who thought they could rule forever with fear and lies. So can Netanyahu still trigger an Iran-US war? I think it's highly unlikely unless Trump is removed from the board entirely. Short of that, the incentives all point the other way. The same is true in Ukraine, in Venezuela, across Europe. There is a coordinated attempt led by very strong actors, above all Russia, and an unconventional U.S. administration to build a new security architecture that ends the madness of permanent proxy wars on the Eurasian rim. The opposition is coming from weak, compromised elites sitting atop corrupt systems and over-leveraged banks. Their time is running out. The question is not whether the old order will crack. The question is how much more suffering they will inflict on others in their attempt to avoid the inevitable.